All right. And just let me know when you guys can see the presentation there.
I can see it.
You can see it? Sweet. So you'll have to trust me that I actually have pants on because I have an ultra wide display, and I found out today that I can't have it going and my laptop open at the same time. The resolution doesn't work so well on Windows. So, but yeah, so like Lee said, I'm going to be talking to you guys tonight about Gatsby. And hopefully by the end of this talk, I'm hoping that you guys can take away some information. It's a buzzword maybe that's been floating around for a little while now, and I hope to speak to it both from the point of view of static applications and also why it might be useful for more than just static apps. So just before we dive into it, just really quick, a little bit about me. I'm a JavaScript developer. I've been developing for about the past 3 years now. I've been really fortunate to be able to be in the kind of React space for basically all of my career. I'm currently laid off due to COVID-19. So if you happen to be working at a company that's hiring, or you know about some sweet positions, my email is there in the footer, along with my personal website and my Twitter handle. So feel free to reach out if you have questions regarding this presentation, or now that I have a little bit more spare time, I'm going to be trying to blog a little bit more. So there might be some useful stuff there for you to check out. My experience with Gatsby, I've been using it now for, I say, the last 6 months. The reason I say that with a little bit of hesitance is that I built my website with Gatsby initially, but I didn't really dig into it too much. And then when I went back to do it a second time, I kind of took a bit of a deeper dive. And that's what led to this presentation, because I think there's just a lot of potential there that goes overlooked or that I didn't really realize. So before diving too deep into, I guess, what Gatsby is and why there's so much hype about it right now, I wanted to start by just taking a step back and really thinking about how we got to our current situation with web development. So if you think back maybe 5 or so years, most things on the web could be easily depicted with the diagram you have here on the right-hand side, where you have your client reaching out to a web server and grabbing some pre-created HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And for the most part, that worked really well, right? I mean, search engines are able to scrape these static files. These files, for the most part, if they're already HTML and CSS, can be sent right over the wire, right into the browser. It was pretty good. But there was some obvious drawbacks, right? And as web development progressed, all of a sudden, we got to this point where static applications and static websites, they were getting kind of, they had their niche, but we wanted something more, right? And so we started to see kind of dynamic web applications. And what I mean when I say dynamic in this case is applications where, you couldn't really build them out ahead of time and just send all of the data across the wire. Instead, it was more of kind of a runtime concern, right? So you've got things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram where, people are publishing every 5 or 10 minutes and you want those latest notifications. And so we started to see this kind of shift where all of a sudden JavaScript in particular really started to dominate the web space. And with it came almost a new way to build applications. And what I mean is, we got such a great ecosystem, a lot of tools. I've outlined them, a few of them here, but there's obviously a ton that I'm missing. But really, we pushed forward, right? We got new module bundlers. We got, CSS in JS solutions to solve problems. We have great frameworks, like React, to attempt to simplify our job as web developers in creating, these great UIs that are maintainable and easy to reason about. But that didn't also come without its own drawbacks, And so one of those main drawbacks that I kind of alluded to earlier was the issue of SEO. And for some applications, that might not be an issue. For example, something like Facebook or Instagram, SEO is not maybe as big of a concern for the content in particular, as the content's constantly changing. But if you have a website where you want users to be able to find information via search, or be able to link out and have search engine optimization realize that every time I search for, great React videos, I happen to come up with 1 Minute React by Lee Daphne, then SEO becomes a little bit more important. The other caveat, of course, and we kind of all see memes about this, has to do with the increased initial load time. And in particular, there's kind of a metric called TTI, meaning time to interactive. And so what can happen with these applications is, because if they're not constructed in a proper way, we end up sending over this huge bundle of JavaScript. So we have the framework, all our associated components and pages, and this can result in the user needing to download and the user's browser needing to parse such a large amount of JavaScript that the actual time before the application becomes interactive is much higher than what we would have seen when we had previous static sites sending over just HTML and CSS. And so we kind of got to this situation where we kind of had really nothing really in the middle, right? We had these kind of antiquated or older technologies that were concerned with developing sort of, static applications or static websites. But we also had all this new tooling that we wanted to be able to use and take advantage of. And so out of that kind of emerged this jam stack, for which Gatsby and other static site generators kind of fall under. Jam being an acronym for JavaScript, API, and markup. And so the basic premise here is, if we start to use JavaScript to reach out to our APIs, and also, as we'll see, use it in the sense that our frameworks are developed in JavaScript, with the combination of markup, and our other new tooling that we have, we can make really great, static experiences using modern tools that are not only perhaps more performant in some ways than what we had in the past, but a much better development experience and much more maintainable. And so there's a gentleman by the name of Jason Langsdorff who worked at Gatsby for a short while before moving on to now work at Netlify. And in one of his courses, he had this quote on a slide, and I thought it was just a pretty elegant way of really describing what the Jamstack aims to be. And he said the Jamstack is an approach to web design that emphasizes shipping only static assets. So static assets, that's maybe what we're used to thinking about as developers as being things like, images or maybe fonts, things of that nature, things that aren't going to evolve and change over time. And if we think about our ability to create static sites and create these subsequent static assets, that offers up a large number of benefits, right? And all of these benefits, or at least the majority of them, rely around this kind of principle that if we have something static, we can take advantage of a content delivery network, or a CDN. So I picked this image off Wikipedia here. The basic premise is this: your favorite cloud provider, and perhaps other software as a service providers as well, have these CDNs. And they're essentially a globally distributed network, right? So rather than having one machine reaching out to users across the globe, you're bringing the information, you're bringing your assets closer to that user. And so we usually do this with things like images, so that the user doesn't have to try and download an image that's fairly large from halfway across the country. Instead, we'd rather have it physically located closer to them. When our sites become static assets, though, we get to take advantage of that CDN in new ways. And perhaps most importantly for us as developers, we get to take advantage of the fact that deploying a Gatsby site or deploying a static site becomes just a matter of putting resources on a CDN. So whereas before, as web developers, we may develop an application, only then later to have to go and decide, okay, do I want to go spin up an Amazon EC2 instance? And okay, then I have to worry about, well, if I do that, how do I scale it horizontally? And how do I scale it vertically? And okay, am I instead going to put some type of container orchestration on top of that? All of those sorts of complications, availability, we don't have to worry about, right? These cloud providers have these content delivery networks in place that are are made to be able to handle these situations. They're made to be able to handle outages and handle redundancy. All that sort of good stuff for us is already taken care of, right? The second benefit is also lower costs, right? If all we're doing is putting static assets on a CDN, we don't have to worry as much about, like I said, whether it be scaling out machines horizontally or vertically. And the pricing model, in a sense, also becomes more predictable because we're charged solely based on throughput. So if we have a rough idea of what our user base is going to be, a rough idea of sort of maybe how many pages they're going to visit or what the payload for those pages are, we can have a much tighter grasp on what we expect our costs to be. And lastly, both because we're using a CDN and because we're generating static assets, we have better performance. So great, right? We have now outlined this sort of philosophy, this idea behind, okay, this all sounds good. It sounds like I'm going to have a more performant, web application. I get to use some modern tooling. How does Gatsby really fit in? And what is the crux of Gatsby? And so it wouldn't be a React meetup without talking about React. And so in line with that, Gatsby's claim to fame is it's a free open source framework that allows us as developers to build blazing fast websites and apps. And I'll touch on the apps part later, but for now, I'm just going to contain our conversation to static sites and static assets. And so really, Gatsby kind of plays the role of the middleman, if you will. This is a depiction from their site. And I think it really does a good job of illustrating what Gatsby aims to do. So the primary idea here is you've got Gatsby in the middle. You've got whatever your content or your data sources are, which can be a variety of things from your kind of traditional content management systems to markdown files to if you're actually making API calls, whatever the case may be, all which are going to go through a GraphQL layer. And we'll talk about GraphQL in a minute. And then we also use, like I said, React, CSS, HTML. And we as developers take the hit to build out our pages at build time so that we then have static assets which we can send. That's in contrast to our typical process with client JavaScript, where it's the client's browser who then has to parse our JavaScript, eventually hit those React calls to create elements, and put those on the pages. So the two main technologies here, of course, are React and GraphQL. And I won't bore you guys too much with React because that's what you're here for. You already know enough about it. You know that it lets us create our UI in I think anyway, a painless way. All of our component patterns that we're used to having, we can still use. And we've got the large ecosystem of tools and components. GraphQL is, I would say, one of the most interesting parts of Gatsby and one of my favorite parts in that it's a specification laid out by Facebook for data fetching. And basically what it says is you should be able to ask for exactly what you need, right? Nothing more, nothing less. So if I have a page where I'm going to display the title of 15 different blog posts or of the 15 most recent blog posts, I shouldn't have to filter that down from a payload where I'm also getting the content of each blog post and the photo from each blog post. I shouldn't have to do that, and I shouldn't have to burden the user with that. Instead, I as a developer should have an intuitive way to be able to call out, retrieve just that data that I need without having to continuously bother some sort of backend team or API team to constantly make me new endpoints. Now, I won't dive too deep into the implementation of GraphQL, but if it's something that sounds interesting, I highly encourage you to read about it because I think it's very interesting and can be used, obviously, outside of Gatsby as well. The other nice thing that comes with GraphQL is powerful developer tools. And what I mean by that is there's actually something called a GraphQL playground that kind of comes by default when you spin up a GraphQL server. And that will allow you to actually inspect, different types that you have in your database. You can look at different sort of queries and what are called mutations. So mutations being kind of your updates, your deletes, those sorts of things. And so it allows developers to iterate much more quickly, because if I was just a front-end developer, for example, could go into that GraphQL playground, look through the documentation that's kind of provided by default, and find out what it is that I might need to do in order to get the data that I need. And the final point being that we can get many resources in a single request. Now, since we're taking the hit here at build time, this isn't as big of a concern for a static site generator, but if you were using GraphQL in a, say, non-static instance, this ability to eliminate what's more commonly known as the N+1 request problem is pretty beneficial. As if all of that weren't enough, Gatsby gives us a lot of great stuff right out of the box. So we've got code splitting. Out of the box, you have a pages folder in Gatsby. Anything you create in there, Gatsby's smart enough to know, okay, this is a page. What components are used? Based on that, what do I need to include in this bundle? So you can forget about the need to configure Webpack and all of that sort of thing. And now you're sending down to the client just what the client needs. Sets up preloading of resources. So things that are needed are there, all your critical assets. Inlining CSS, and this, yes, also goes out to if you decide to use a CSS in JS solution. In the same way that we're able to determine which components are needed by particular pages, we can also associate the required CSS, determine what that is, and inline it into the head of the document. So that's reducing another request to go and fetch additional, in this case, styles, but data for the sake of conversation to load the page. And prefetching, a way to hint to say, hey, you know what, browser, I know we're on the About page right now, but when you get a second, can you in the background go and fetch the sign-in page so that when the user clicks on it, or if the user clicks on it, it's instantly there. All of this for free, out of the box, no questions asked. But if that wasn't enough, Gatsby continues to allow you to deeper customize your needs. And it does this through a system which I think, in a sense, resembles React, in that it resembles the idea of composition, right? In the same way that React is infamous for composition over inheritance, Gatsby sites at their core follow sort of a composition process, and I'll outline what I mean by that. So at the root level, we start with plugins, and plugins are a way for us to take site customizations, put them into a module, and have that module be installable via the command line. So a common instance for this would be perhaps you start out with a default Gatsby site, but you know that you want to add TypeScript. Well, if you were in a regular project, you may have to go through some process of adding additional Babel configuration and making sure that your Webpack config could handle this and all those sorts of things. In the Gatsby world, that functionality is bundled up into this plugin. So you would install it via the command line. And then with a few changes to your Gatsby configuration file, you'd be able to start using TypeScript as an example. This is also where you would install plugins for obtaining and transforming your data. Built on top of plugins are themes. Now, themes extend and are not only, although they can include, but usually don't, stylistically. So whereas we usually hear the word themes and we think, like a WordPress theme where you have a bunch of, stylistic components. In the Gatsby world, a theme is a default configuration or shared functionality that's abstracted away. So for a common use case, perhaps you work at an agency, and when you guys decide to roll out sites, every site you start with, you want it to have a particular configuration of, say, TypeScript and Jest and your CSS and JS framework of choice. Well, rather than having to install those plugins every time, having a theme with that functionality allows you to just start from there. And then the next layer is starters. So take theme, maybe I throw a couple components in there for you, have a couple styles laid out or something like that. And then recipes, which are something fairly new to me that I only found out about a couple of days ago. But the basic idea with a recipe is if you have the Gatsby CLI installed, it not only allows you to, under the hood, install a plugin, but will also take care of setting up any extra configuration. So where before I said if you wanted to do something like TypeScript, we would be installing a plugin and then modifying our configuration file, a recipe would walk you through that via the command line, asking you questions and setting up that configuration for you. And so this is where I think Gatsby doesn't get enough credit, and that is that we've talked a lot at this point about at least why I think Gatsby is great. Maybe you disagree with me, but there's one thing that we haven't really touched on that Gatsby quote kind of alluded to, and that was the idea of blazing fast apps. And so there's this kind of misconception that Gatsby is really great for static site generation, but that if you really need a dynamic app, well, you're probably going to go with your traditional Create React app. And I just kind of want to debunk that at this point, and I'll explain why. You know, a lot of the time, a lot of what we build is static. We might not like it to be, but at least some of it is, right? So as a use case example, perhaps you have a company website where you may have some, you know, client protected routes that require authentication, but you still have maybe an About Us page, a contact form, all of that, which could be statically generated. You know, and Gatsby will allow you to do things like that, right? There are recipes, I shouldn't use the word recipe, there are tutorials online that will show you how to do things like client protected routes. And when you do that, you can still use anything that's valid JavaScript and valid React is by definition valid Gatsby. So a lot of times you'll see people asking, well, how do I do this with Gatsby? And the question really is, well, how would you do it with React? Because it's the exact same, right? There's certain ways that we can allude to say, hey, Gatsby, yeah, see this GraphQL query? I need you to go and fetch that data to build this page out at build time, versus, hey, I'm going to make a fetch request, you know, when this page loads. And we have the ability to do both. And so with all the code splitting, preloading, prefetching, sort of that goodness, excuse me, Gatsby is not only a good starting point for static websites, but it's also a good point for web applications. And I have this drink meme here to remind me to talk about sort of the rehydration process. And so what that means is basically at build time, Gatsby will go through, and under the hood, when you have JSX and it gets transpiled, really what you have is a bunch of calls to a function called react.createElement. And that does exactly what it sounds like under the hood. It says react.createElement div. I'm just going to create a div. And so Gatsby allows us to say, great, I see that you're creating a div. I'm going to go ahead and make that static markup page with a div there, as opposed to what usually happens, which is we send React, we send a basic HTML file with a single div that React hooks onto. What's interesting, however, is when we get to the client, React goes through this rehydration process. Meaning React then looks and is able to tell, hey, I rendered this tab component and the HTML is already there, but I see that you have this use state call and there's going to be functionality that I want to use so that I can update the DOM tree. Not a problem. So we kind of get the best of both worlds in that we can still have that statically rendered content and still have our ability to do and make dynamic experiences. And I think that that is sorely undersold with Gatsby because, like I say, 80 to 90% of people you talk about know that it's great for static sites, but think that that's about it. So that was basically all I had. I hope I didn't I hope I didn't go too deep or stay too high. I hope that I left you with just enough to maybe walk away and ask some questions or do some additional research. There's obviously a lot that I didn't have the time, nor do I think I would be able to keep your attention long enough to go through in detail all the internals and ins and outs. But I think that it's important to know that you know, Gatsby provides a really good jumping off point for a lot of what we do as web developers. And, you know, yeah, I guess that's really all I have to say. It's a good point, and I think it has a lot of potential, and I really like the way that it's structured. Um, yeah, and thank you for listening. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to attempt to answer them. I don't guarantee that I'll have an answer, but I can certainly try. Or if there's none, I can throw it back over to lead off me.